Please subscribe and share for more story. The first sign that a person no longer exists is not death, but silence. Not the gentle kind, but the kind that presses in on the chest and refuses to answer back. For Colonel Miriam Hale, that silence began at Gate B17 of Cascadia International Airport. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she sat in her wheelchair, dress blues perfectly pressed, hands folded with practiced discipline. She had sent the message herself. Arriving 2:20 p.m. Gate B17. I'm home. 18 months in military hospitals. 13 surgeries. Titanium in her spine. Nerves that still burned without warning. She had survived an explosion overseas. She had survived pain. What she did not expect was to survive return and find no one waiting. Around her, reunions bloomed. Children ran into open arms. Spouses clung to uniforms. Laughter echoed. Miriam watched it all like someone observing life through thick glass. Minutes passed. Then more. Her phone remained silent. No vibration. No apology. Just the hollow truth settling in. She checked the clock again. 40 minutes now. A transport officer approached gently. Ma'am, do you want me to wait a bit longer? Miriam shook her head, forcing a thin smile.
No, Sergeant.
You've done your duty. Pride was stubborn that way. As the officer walked off, Miriam unlocked her phone. The message showed red. No reply. She swallowed hard. She had 2 sons. Daniel Hale, the eldest, sharp and ambitious, whose business school tuition she had paid from a forward base. And Noah Hale, younger, quieter, forever drifting behind his brother's shadow. Daniel was married to Clara, a woman whose politeness always felt sharpened, like glass smoothed just enough to cut. Neither son came. Not even a call. Miriam exhaled slowly, the way doctors had taught her during pain management. All right, she whispered to herself. Then we proceed. The wheels of her chair squeaked softly as she turned toward the taxi stand, carrying her silence with her. The taxi ride home was heavy with unspoken discomfort. The driver glanced at her uniform, at the chair, then back to the road. Address? He asked. Miriam gave it without ceremony. She transferred herself into the back seat alone, ignoring his offer of help. Independence had become a ritual of survival. Outside the window, towering evergreens blurred past, green and alive. The world had not paused for her war. As they climbed into the wealthy hillside neighborhood overlooking the Sound, Miriam spoke again. Stop here. 3 blocks short. The driver frowned. You sure? She handed him a crisp bill. Yes. She needed distance. Needed to see before being seen. From behind a manicured hedge, she looked toward her house, the cedar lodge with river stone and wide windows she and her late husband had chosen together. 2 cars sat in the driveway. One was Daniel's. The other hers. Her jaw tightened. The porch lights flicked on automatically. Someone had reset the timer. The front door opened. A woman stepped out holding a wine glass, laughing into her phone. Miriam recognized the robe immediately. Her robe. Silk. Hand-painted blossoms. A gift from Kyoto. Clara leaned against the railing, carefree, as if she belonged there. No, I told you, everything's handled, Clara said lightly. We're practically settled. Miriam felt something go very still inside her. No explosion. No tears. Just emptiness, clean and cold, like a cleared battlefield. Someone had moved into her life piece by piece.
House. Car. Clothing.
Authority. She expected rage. Instead, she felt clarity. Not yet, she murmured. Without announcing herself, Miriam turned her chair around. The motor hummed softly as dusk fell. She disappeared into the quiet, already planning. That night, Miriam checked into a roadside motel called Pine Hollow Inn, paying cash and signing in under her maiden name. The room smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet. It was perfect. Anonymous. Safe. Alone. She lay awake listening to strangers breathe through thin walls and felt, for the first time in months, completely unseen. In the morning, she went downtown, not to her neighborhood bank, but the corporate headquarters. The teller's fingers slowed as she reviewed the accounts. Her polite smile faltered. "Ma'am, there have been some unusual transactions." Miriam nodded calmly. "Print everything." Withdrawals she hadn't made. Transfers she didn't recognize. And then the trust, newly created, bearing her husband's name with a slight variation. Trustees, Daniel and Clara Hale. Miriam's pulse remained steady. She remembered the power of attorney Daniel had brought her before surgery. Just in case, Mom. She left the bank with a folder full of proof and no expression at all. Her next stop was the office of Edward Lang, the estate attorney who had once managed her husband's affairs. He went pale when he saw her. "They told me you were incapacitated," he said quietly. He showed her the emails, carefully written messages from Clara expressing concern, suggesting planning before it was too late. Edward had delayed, unsettled by their urgency. Something felt wrong, he admitted. Miriam appreciated his honesty. From there, she visited a storage unit she had rented years earlier. Inside were records of a life lived deliberately, property deeds, military files, duplicate signatures locked in a fireproof safe. Under a single bulb, Miriam worked methodically, comparing documents, marking inconsistencies. By sunset, she had a roadmap. That night, she parked on a hill overlooking her house. Lights glowed inside. They were eating dinner where she once sat. The emptiness inside her began to harden into purpose. Miriam hired Lucia Vega, a civil attorney recommended through a veterans network. Lucia didn't offer sympathy. She offered precision. "This is identity theft," she said after reviewing the files. "They tried to replace you." Within days, the power of attorney was revoked. Accounts frozen. Audits launched. But Miriam wanted more than legal restoration. She wanted understanding. For 2 weeks, she observed quietly. Daniel left for work every morning at 8:15. Clara attended yoga, drank smoothies, wore Miriam's scarf. One night, Miriam entered the house using an old key they hadn't bothered to change. Her study was gone, replaced. She took only what mattered: mail they ignored, documents they mishandled. She left without a trace. "Order," she whispered. "That's all this is." And order was coming. Her final move was public. Miriam donated the house to a foundation for disabled women veterans. Invitations were sent to a gala. Daniel and Clara attended, unaware. When Miriam stood to speak, the room fell silent. "This home," she said calmly, "will no longer shelter theft." Gasps followed. Eviction notices were served the next morning. The fallout was swift. Reputations collapsed. Accounts locked. Daniel confronted her once. "You set us up." Miriam met his eyes.
No.
"You erased me. I simply wrote myself back in." Months later, Miriam moved into a small coastal cottage. Life became quiet, purposeful. The silence that once crushed her had changed shape. It no longer meant absence. It meant peace. She had not lost a family. She had reclaimed herself. The legal pressure moved quickly, but Miriam did not rely on courts.
Alone.
She understood something her children had forgotten. Systems respond faster when watched. She stayed at Pine Hollow Inn, rising early each day to document everything. She photographed utility bills still addressed to her, recorded dates, copied statements. "They assumed time was on their side," she said quietly to Lucia over the phone. "They assumed I wouldn't return whole." Lucia replied without hesitation. "That assumption will cost them." Meanwhile, Miriam watched Daniel's public life unravel in small but telling ways. Meetings canceled. Calls unanswered. Clara's social media posts slowed, then stopped. Miriam felt no joy in it. Only confirmation. Power built on deception always collapses under light. Each evening, Miriam returned to her room, lined her documents on the bed, and worked until her hands ached. Pain was familiar. Purpose made it tolerable. One afternoon, Miriam received a call she hadn't expected. "Colonel Hale," a woman asked. "This is Renee Collins from the Veterans Housing Alliance." Miriam listened as Renee explained the shortage. Women sleeping in cars, on couches, nowhere safe to heal. Miriam looked out the motel window at passing traffic. I have a house, she said calmly. Silence followed. It's currently occupied, Miriam added. But not for long. Renee's voice broke. You'd really do that? Miriam smiled faintly. I'm not giving away a house. I'm restoring its purpose. That conversation grounded her. This wasn't revenge. It was redirection. She wasn't destroying her past. She was repurposing it into something honest. The eviction notices were delivered on a Tuesday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. Miriam watched from across the street, unseen. Clara's voice carried through the open door. This has to be a mistake. Daniel argued with the officer. Our attorney, you no longer have authority, the officer replied evenly. Miriam felt no triumph, only closure. That afternoon, Lucia confirmed the final filings. The house is legally reassigned. Locks will be changed by noon. Miriam nodded. Good. Later that evening, Daniel called. She let it ring. Then voicemail. Mom, please. We can explain. She deleted it. Explanation without accountability was just noise. The confrontation came days later, arranged through attorneys. Miriam entered the living room that was no longer hers, and yet finally felt free inside it. Daniel looked smaller. Clara avoided eye contact. I'm not here to negotiate, Miriam said evenly. I'm here to end this. Clara snapped. You chose the military over us. Miriam's gaze sharpened. I chose service. You chose entitlement. She placed a folder on the table. You planned my absence. You counted on my death. Daniel whispered, we thought you'd never know. Miriam stood. That was your final mistake. She left without waiting for a response. Weeks later, Miriam settled into a modest cottage overlooking the water. The veteran's house opened quietly, filled with women who greeted her with gratitude that didn't demand anything in return. Miriam volunteered, attended therapy, learned the rhythms of her new life. One rainy evening, she watched the tide roll in and thought of the airport gate, the silence that had nearly erased her. It no longer hurt. Silence she realized could also be space. Space to rebuild. Space to choose who deserved a place in her life. Family wasn't blood. It was presence. And when no one showed up at the gate, she had learned how to walk forward alone and build something stronger on the other side. Miriam's new routine settled into her bones slowly, like weather changing direction. Mornings began with physical therapy at a small clinic near the harbor. The therapist, a patient man named Caleb, never rushed her. You're stronger than you think, he reminded her as she pushed through the ache. I've been stronger, she replied once, breath tight. Caleb shook his head gently. Strength changes shape. That doesn't mean it's gone. The words stayed with her. After therapy, Miriam walked the short distance to the veterans' residence, now officially named Harbor Lighthouse. The women there greeted her with quiet respect, not pity. One of them, Janine, a former medic, offered Miriam coffee. You didn't just give us walls, Janine said. You gave us room to breathe. Miriam nodded, unable to speak for a moment. News of the donation spread through Port Blossom faster than Miriam expected. Local papers praised the anonymous benefactor before her name eventually surfaced. Reactions were mixed. Some neighbors applauded her generosity. Others whispered, confused by Daniel and Clara's sudden disappearance from social circles. At a grocery store one afternoon, an old acquaintance approached her. I heard about your family, the woman said cautiously. Miriam met her gaze. So did I, she replied calmly. The woman blinked, unsure how to respond. Miriam moved on. She had learned that not every question deserved an answer. That evening, Lucia called. They're considering a settlement, she said. Public exposure is hurting them. Miriam looked out at the dark water. No settlement, she said. Let the truth stand on its own. Daniel tried once more. This time, he came to the cottage unannounced. Miriam saw him through the window before he knocked. She opened the door, but did not invite him in. You look different, he said awkwardly. So do you, she replied. He swallowed. We were scared, Mom. We thought you were gone. Miriam folded her arms. No. You hoped I was. The words landed heavily between them. Daniel's eyes filled, but she did not soften. "I loved you," she continued. "But love without integrity becomes something else. I won't carry that anymore." He nodded slowly, as if understanding too late. When he left, Miriam closed the door with steady hands. The season shifted. Harbor Lighthouse filled to capacity. Laughter returned to the rooms of the old lodge, not the careless kind, but laughter shaped by survival. Miriam watched women regain confidence, relearn trust, and rebuild plans. During a small gathering, Renee raised a toast. "To Miriam," she said, "who turned erasure into refuge." Miriam lifted her glass, but spoke only 3 words. They did the work. Applause followed, but she focused on the faces in front of her. This, she realized, was legacy. Not bloodlines or inheritance, but impact. On a quiet evening, Miriam returned to the airport, not to travel, but to sit. She chose a bench near the gates and watched people reunite. The silence no longer frightened her. It reminded her how far she had come. She touched the smooth metal of her chair and smiled faintly. She had survived war, betrayal, absence, and she was still here, still choosing, still building. When she finally stood to leave, she did so without looking back at the gates. Some arrivals didn't need witnesses. Some victories didn't need applause. They only needed truth. Time did what it always did. It revealed what noise had once hidden. Daniel and Clara faded from Port Blossom entirely. Their names stopped appearing on donor lists, invitation cards, and community boards. Miriam heard about it indirectly. They moved south. Renee mentioned one afternoon while sorting files. Miriam nodded. "People often run when mirrors are held up," she said. The comment wasn't bitter. It was observational. In quiet moments, Miriam reflected on how easily power had changed hands when she was absent. It wasn't cruelty alone that allowed it. It was convenience. People accepted the story that required the least effort. That understanding sharpened her resolve. She began speaking privately to veterans about legal preparedness. "Never assume goodwill replaces documentation," she told them. They listened closely. One evening, Miriam received a letter. Not an email, but handwritten. It was from Noah, her younger son. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't defend himself. He simply wrote, "I failed you by staying silent. I don't expect a reply." Miriam read it twice. Silence, she knew now, was not neutral. It was a decision. She placed the letter in a drawer and closed it. Some relationships needed time more than words. If Noah truly understood, he would wait without pressure. Miriam went to bed that night feeling neither angry nor relieved, only resolved. Harbor Lighthouse expanded its programs quietly.
Counseling.
Job placement. Legal aid. Miriam attended meetings, but rarely spoke first. When she did, people listened. During one session, a young veteran asked, "How did you survive losing your family?" Miriam answered without hesitation. "I didn't lose them," she said. "I stopped chasing who they pretended to be." The room fell silent. The truth landed gently but firmly. Later, Janine whispered, "I needed to hear that." Miriam smiled. Words mattered most when they were earned. The final legal documents arrived on a crisp autumn morning. Lucia called. "It's done. No appeals." Miriam thanked her and hung up. She walked down to the shoreline, the wind sharp against her face. For a moment, she thought of her husband, of the life they had built together. "You'd like this," she said aloud. The water answered with a steady rhythm. Closure didn't come as relief. It came as alignment, things returning to their proper place. At a community forum months later, Miriam was asked to speak publicly. She stood at the podium, hands steady. "Erasure doesn't happen all at once," she said. "It happens quietly, when people assume you are done speaking." Faces in the crowd leaned forward. "If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Your presence has value even when others pretend not to see it." Applause followed, but Miriam focused on the veterans seated in the front row. That was who the words were for. On the anniversary of her return, Miriam visited the harbor alone. She watched ferries cut through the water, carrying strangers toward reunions she no longer needed. The memory of Gate B17 surfaced briefly, then passed. She felt no ache, only perspective. Absence had not broken her. It had clarified her. That night, Miriam sat on her porch as dusk settled. The world was quiet, but not empty. The silence was full now, layered with meaning and intention. She understood something she hadn't before. Being erased by others did not mean she had disappeared. It meant she was free to redefine herself without interference. She lifted her tea in a small, private toast. To survival, to dignity, to choosing who deserves a place in your life. Some legacies are inherited. Others are built, patiently, after the fire. In the months that followed, Miriam learned how to live without bracing herself for impact. Her days were no longer measured by conflict or defense, but by intention. She planted herbs in small clay pots along the porch rail. She kept a notebook where she wrote observations, not plans. Sometimes she laughed with the women at Harbor Lighthouse. Other times, she simply listened. When people asked how she found the strength to begin again, she answered honestly. "I didn't begin again," she said. "I continued, without carrying what never belonged to me." The past no longer demanded explanations. It existed as proof of endurance, not a destination. Miriam understood now that survival was not the loud triumph people imagined. It was quiet consistency. It was waking up and choosing dignity again and again, even when no one was watching. On a clear morning, Miriam walked the shoreline as sunlight spilled across the water. She moved slowly, deliberately, aware of each step and grateful for it. The silence around her was no longer a wound. It was space, earned and protected. She thought of the airport gate one last time, not with pain, but with clarity. That moment had not been her ending. It had been her release. She had been erased, yes, but in that erasure, she had reclaimed her voice, her name, and her story. Some people wait their whole lives to be chosen. Miriam had learned something far more powerful. She had chosen herself.